I have a grudge against HYPERCHARGE. Allow me. Wait a second. I already used this intro. Yes, this is the second part to my rework to every single HYPERCHARGE. I know it took a really long time, I am sorry, but it is finally here. Thank you so much for the wait. And as I said last time, be warned, because I'm gonna suggest some pretty wild stuff, because I don't like the way that HYPERCHARGEs work right now. A lot more of stat increases other than just actual abilities, so be ready for some really weird abilities. So now that you have been warned, let's start with the first HYPERCHARGE of the day, Jesse's HYPERCHARGE. Honestly, this HYPERCHARGE is just very strong because it is very easily cyclable, and it is just so strong. So let's start with the nerfs, because that's the most important thing, honestly. The turret bonus HP would be reduced from plus 50% to plus 20%. So now the turret would deal the same bonus damage as it would have bonus HP. The HYPERCHARGE duration would be reduced from 5 seconds to 4 seconds. The HYPERCHARGE it is meant to be for the turret, not exactly for Jesse, so reducing the duration of the HYPERCHARGE will allow to Jesse not being able to use the HYPERCHARGE in some weird ways, let's just call it that. The bonus shield would be removed, the bonus damage would be really reduced from plus 25% to plus 10%. The bonus speed would also be reduced from plus 26% to plus 15%. So overall the HYPERCHARGE is weaker, but now let's talk about the buffs that the turret would have. The first thing, and the most easy to understand, the HYPERCHARGE turret range would be increased from 9 tiles to 10.66. This pretty much means that unless you're covered by a wall, the HYPERCHARGE turret would be almost always shooting at someone because of how much range that would actually be. That's more range than Piper, just for you to have an idea. So it would not be safe at any point to even try to approach the HYPERCHARGE turret. Also, the projectile speed of the turret would be increased by 20% to kinda compensate for this bonus range that the turret would have. Now that we already talked about the simple stuff, let's talk about the new very weird extra that the HYPERCHARGE turret would have. The HYPERCHARGE turret would now have what I would say a scanning ability. Imagine this, there is a circle just like Cordelius around the HYPERCHARGE turret. That circle will reveal enemies inside bushes. And while there is one person inside the HYPERCHARGE turret's passive radius, the HYPERCHARGE duration will be increased by 31.75% per second. So because the HYPERCHARGE rate decays 25% per second, that means that while there is one person inside that area, the HYPERCHARGE can last forever. Why is this exactly? Just to be a way that Jesse can actually cycle the HYPERCHARGE turrets. And this would also give more area control to the HYPERCHARGE turret as well, which would also make it a lot stronger. People would not want to be close to the turret, and they could not even go further because the turret now has a lot more range. This would make the turret so incredibly versatile. Like, the main idea with these rewards is just to not make the HYPERCHARGE turret only usable in heists. The turret would have area control and would have a lot of range, so you could even position the turret in a safe position, because the turret would still be able to hit its shots, because the projectile speed it's also faster. So overall the idea of the HYPERCHARGE is just to make the turret as versatile as possible while making the stats a bit weaker, and also to give the HYPERCHARGE turret a little bit of a bonus with all of these buffs to the actual HYPERCHARGE turrets. Next on the list we have El Primo, and El Primo's HYPERCHARGE it is just useless. Besides the stat increase, there is just no actual advantages on using it, so let's fix that. To start off, the HYPERCHARGE rate would be increased from 30% to 35%. So now, instead of needing 3.33 supers, you would only need 2.85 supers. So it would be, start off, a little bit easier to cycle the HYPERCHARGE. You know that effect when you hit someone and you pull it to the middle? Yeah, now that would be completely changed, and instead that pulling effect would be at the moment when you press the HYPERCHARGE. So as soon as you click on the button of the HYPERCHARGE, in a 5 tile radius, you just bump everyone to where you are. Imagine this like Jackie's super, but a tiny bit different, because you have that tiny jump when they go into the middle. And because the pulling effect is now just when you click on the HYPERCHARGE, the new Hyper Super effect would be that when you when you land with the super, you release a massive shockwave that would have the exact same range as Frank's hypercharged super, but it would deal half the damage of the super and would deal a tiny knockback and slow the enemies down for 2 seconds. This extra damage and slowing effect also happens to people that are inside the regular super radius. So you would have just so much area control with this hypercharge, and because they're slowed down for 2 entire seconds, you can also just approach them a lot easier to cycle more supers to use more massive shockwaves that will slow the entire enemy team. To just make up for all of this, there is also a little bit of a nerf. The bonus movement speed will be completely removed. If you want bonus movement speed, just use the second star power. I think it's a bit overkill that you can get bonus movement speed and bonus movement speed at the same time. It just feels pretty weird, honestly. And the bonus shield will be reduced from plus 25% to plus 15%. Forgot to mention, the bonus damage would be increased from 5% 15% to make sure that El Primo can be extra aggressive with this hypercharge. El Primo is supposed to be a tank counter, but that it's also a tank, and the hypercharge does not reflect that. Pulling enemies to the center would be very good just at the start so that you can just rush into everyone and immediately get supers, and also the hyper super would just give you area control and be very easy for you to just destroy the entire enemy team, which is kinda the idea of the hypercharge in the first place. Next we have Fang's hypercharge, and honestly Fang's hypercharge has been a mistake from the very beginning. Removing the skill from a super like that should have never been done. So I'm gonna completely change the hypercharge effect from passing through walls to the hypercharge super has infinite bounces. In a certain way, and against a couple matchups, it's actually better for you, and yes, you can just travel throughout the entire map with infinite bounces. That's just the idea. It would be a fun concept in my opinion, which is also the purpose of the hypercharges, just rushing throughout the entire map regardless of how many entities are there. You would just go against all of them. Besides the popcorn trail, now you would also leave a fire trail. This would give you just a tiny bit more of area control, because I have no idea what was the purpose of the popcorns, honestly, because I mean, it feels like just an unnecessary extra that does not even do its job well, which supposedly this area control. So now you would also leave this fire trail. Imagine this like Stu's fire trail throughout the entirety of your super. It's supposed to be a dragon ability kinda, and there is no fire, there is popcorns, what the hell. And also the damage would be 25% of the damage of your super over 4 seconds. So it will not deal a lot of damage, but it would last a little bit. While Fang is on the super hypercharge, he receives less 50% damage. This is the same as Chuck and as Daryl, but for the hypercharge super. And also the hypercharge rate will be drastically increased from 25% to 45%. So instead of needing 4 supers, which is just way too much, now you would only need 2.22 supers. So it'd be so easy to cycle the hypercharge. But the reality is, you would not get that many benefits because it would just not be that aggressive. And also because of the following nerfs. The bonus damage would be removed. The annoying part of the bonus damage, it is just how broken it works with his first star power. That bonus damage, it should not be here because of its brokenness potential. The bonus movement speed will be reduced from 25% to 15%, and the bonus shield will be removed as well. So, no longer shield, no longer bonus damage. The only shield that you have is while you are a hypercharged super, and the bonus speed is reduced, but honestly that is the one with the less impact because I mean you're on the super, so there is no big value. So honestly I feel like Fang hypercharge would just go from this overly aggressive character that gives you a guaranteed win, because that's literally what he does, to this more in a certain way all around. You have the shield, which will help you to keep the aggressivity. You have the infinite bounces, which will give you mobility, and you have the popcorns and the fire that will give you area control. All of these would just make Fang hypercharge just balanced in every possible aspect, while in my opinion being a fun hypercharge. Imagine yourself just bouncing all over the place. How fun does that sound? Next on the list we have Miko, and honestly his hypercharge sucks. Not to mention that it also takes ages to get. So to start off, the hypercharge rate will be increased from 50% to 60%. So now instead of 2 supers, it only takes 1.66 supers. In reality, this actually does not change that many interactions. That means that you need less 2 hits, or I think that 1 super, which is not really that much because it just simply takes really ages to get that hypercharge. But regardless, it is a good buff. But now let's talk about the actual hypercharge. All of the bonus stats are completely removed. This will make sense. While you are hypercharged, on the other hand, the range of your attack and the area of effect, or the radius, will both be increased by 33%. So it would be, while you are hypercharged, you would have pretty much always the second gadget active, and you would also get a tiny bit more radius, which would be very good to attack more than one person at the same time. On top of that, the hypercharge, it is really punishing when you use the super, especially if you don't know how it works and just use the super right at the start. Like, come on, don't do that. While you are on the air, the hypercharge decays 75% slower, so technically your super, instead of being 6 seconds of hypercharge, which is not even possible, it would now be around 1.5 seconds, which, I mean, that is honestly a really good buff. And also, while you are in the sky, you drop bananas. Imagine these bananas like Janet's bombs, but they don't deal any damage at all, they just simply slow the enemies down. This is just to make it slightly easier to like follow persons with your super. While you are in the sky, if they get hit by a banana, it is most likely for them to get hit by the super, which will also get the stun duration increased from 2 seconds to 1.5 seconds. No, wait. Honestly, I feel like he deserves these buffs because, on top of everything, he is not the best brawler right now. I feel like he overall needs some buffs, but generally buffing the hypercharge, it's just something that he needs because his hypercharge is just really bad. The stun is absolutely worthless, and there is just no excitement at all with this hypercharge, not to mention how long it also takes. So hopefully with all these buffs, Miko's hypercharge will no longer be one of the worst in the game. Leon. Honestly, I am pretty sure that this one will be a little bit more controversial, but let's start with the basics. The hypercharge rate will be increased from 30% to 40%. It takes ages to get the hypercharge, unless you're playing on quickfire, but we don't talk about quickfire around here. Also, the hypercharge duration will be increased from 5 seconds to 6 seconds. Now, before you start freaking out, let's talk about some very severe nerfs. To start off, both the bonus damage and bonus shield will be completely removed. So Leon, while hypercharge, will no longer just absolutely shred you, which it is a good thing, honestly. A really good one. And also, when Leon attacks, you will now be able to see purple electricity from the place where he attacked. Instead of just seeing shurikens flying out of pure air, now you could see a little bit of electricity to just have a bare idea where Leon actually is, because sometimes it's just impossible, absolutely impossible really. But now this is where the controversial part starts in, which is this bonus effect. When you press the hypercharge button, you will summon around yourself 3 Leon clones. And when these Leon clones die, and by this matter, whenever a Leon clone dies, that Leon clone will just do a poof. Imagine this like in a certain way Maisie's gadget, that stun part. Imagine just like that, they would that poof, and if the enemy was inside that area, they would be silenced for an entire second, which would just give a new utility to the clone rather than just giving what? Shield, like, which is not even really that helpful. Now if the enemy is too close, they will actually be silenced, which does give you the opportunity to use this hypercharge in a more defensive way. And also it makes not mandatory to get the hypercharge with the super, but that's just another extra. Honestly, Leon is the supposed invisible classic guy, and they always have clones, but clones just simply don't really work with Leon because most of the times you reveal that you're invisible by doing so. But I think that by doing this by just pressing the hypercharge, not the super of the hypercharge, it would not be really the worst thing in the world. And also this is just a straight up buff to the gadget when you think about it, which is also really cool. Now we have Crow. Honestly, he is pretty bad overall, and his hypercharge only allows him to be helpful on heist. Other than that, he's just simply not good, which the hypercharge doesn't really help out that much. So let's start with the most basic stuff. The hypercharge charge rate will be increased again from 60% up to 80%. So now, instead of needing 1.66 supers, you would instead need 1.25, which I know that the percentage change, it sounds massive, but the reality is, in actual super charge rate, it's not that big of a change. Although the duration being increased, it is more important, from 5 seconds to 6 seconds. So now you have 6 seconds to just poison all of the enemies, which will be very helpful, because now, instead of poisoning the enemies, you would now be shooting acid with the daggers. What would the acid do? Well, great question. Now, number 1, your attack, while hypercharged of course, will go through enemies. That is the first thing. The poison deals double the damage, because it's not poison, it's freaking acid, and acid hurts. The enemy healing, instead of being reduced by 40%, which is the basic just of the poison, it will now be decreased by 75%, which is the same as Byron's first star power actually. And on top of all of this, Crow will receive 30% less damage from hyper poison enemies, or from acid enemies, if you want to say it that way, but this sounds a bit awkward. But obviously, with so many great buffs, we need to balance this, because heist. Poor boy. The super daggers of the hypercharge no longer come back. That is the first thing. Now they only go, because coming back is just simply adding so much damage, and it's just way too much damage, especially to enemies that cannot move, like the heist safe. Poor boy again. But also, the hypercharge bonus shield will be removed, because you receive 30% damage from acid enemies. The bonus damage will also be removed. The objective with this hypercharge, it is to focus a little bit more onto the control kind of side of Crow, and not so much on the assassin or damage dealer, whatever you want to say. And also, the hypercharge bonus speed will be reduced from 24% to 15%. Hopefully with all of this change, Crow's hypercharge becomes way much more versatile, because honestly, he deserves it. Next on the list we have Dinah, and this will be a bit more simplistic one. To start off, the hypercharge rate will be slightly increased from 30% to 35%, so instead of needing 3.33 supers, you would instead need 2.85 supers, which would be very great for cycling that third hypercharge super. But the bonus shield and the bonus speed are both removed, and the bonus damage will be greatly reduced from 25% to 10%, because that hypercharge bomb destroys everything. It deals 8,000 damage. How can that be possibly fair? But with all of those nerfs, because honestly, because of the changes, it is more than enough than a buff. Now, when you press the hypercharge actual button, you know the effect that you do with the hypercharge bomb, that it throws bombs all over the place? Well, that's pretty much what would happen when you just click on the hypercharge button. You just throw, I think, 12 stick bombs all over in a circle shape. Honestly, I feel like that would be a great plus, especially because now we can just get that like last stick of supercharge with the hypercharge. And I always like to make the hypercharge not super dependent, so that extra when you press the hypercharge would be very good. Next on the list we have Edgar, and honestly this might be the most complex of them all, because I have a very specific idea for this one. I wanted that with the hypercharge, instead of you just getting simply stronger, you would get stronger by succeedingly being able to kill the enemies. So, explaining a little bit better. Number 1, the hypercharge rate will be increased from 40% to 45%, so instead of 2.5 supers, you would only need 2.22 supers, just for you to cycle that hypercharge a bit quicker. Now, here are the nerfs. The bonus speed will be removed, so now if you want to actually reach someone, you will still need to rely on your bonus movement speed from the super, and so is the bonus damage removed, so that now you will get from the bonus of the hypercharge that I will say in a second. Also, the actual bonus reload and supercharge rate that you gain after using the hypercharge super are both cut in half. So before you freak out after the buffs that I will say in a second, remember that the hypercharge no longer has almost any of the stat increases, and that the hypercharge actual effect was pretty much cut in half, just for you to remember. So now about actually the new effects, and I use this opportunity to say that the new name of the hypercharge would be grinding, and it will make sense in a bit. Now, whenever you use one of your hypercharge supers, the speed boost that you get from the super would last till the end of the hypercharge. So if used in a good timing, you could technically get this hypercharge extra speed boost for very long, and also the speed boost would be stackable as well. So if you use a lot of supers during the hypercharge, you get faster and faster and faster. And for each hyper super that you would do, doesn't matter if you hit or not, you would get a 5% bonus damage and an additional 5% life steal, and your hypercharge would get refilled by 0.5 seconds. Just also to compensate a little bit because of the time you spend on the air, but at the same time the idea is that if you successfully manage to kill the enemies and use supers, you get rewarded with more hypercharge and more power, and just become stronger and stronger, to the point where most of the brawlers, if you were able to kill the weakest enemies first and then proceed to the strongest, you would most likely be able to defeat them. Also, you know how in a long time ago hypercharges were no longer able to refill themselves? Well, that would not be the case for Edgar. If you hit at an enemy, not only it would charge your super, as it would also recharge the hypercharge. Remember that because all of those buffs to the bonus charge rate were cut in half, you would not nearly get as much of the recharge or refill to the hypercharge, but it would still be an important detail. And finally, and probably the most important part, for each enemy that you kill during the hypercharge, you get an additional 5% damage, 5% lifesteal, and it would refill your hypercharge by 2 seconds. This does not work against pets. So the main idea with this whole rework, it is, at baseline, just from the hypercharge, Edgar is no longer as strong. That's also one of the reasons why you can get the hypercharge just a tiny bit faster. But now, if you manage to kill the enemies successfully and you actually get to deal a lot of damage to them as well and use a lot of supers and just cycle all of that, you might be very well one of the strongest brawlers in the game. So actually, in a certain way, to everyone that might hate Edgar, this would actually in a certain way bring some skill to the brawler, especially to the hypercharge. I know that Edgar wins a lot of 1v1 interactions, but he still needs to pick a good enemy, otherwise his entire hypercharge will be completely waste. So it's time to gamble with Edgar. Next, we have talked about Belle. While Edgar was probably the most complex hypercharge till now, Belle, I am pretty sure that it is the most simple of them all. So, to start off, the two buffs and actual entirely new extras to the hypercharge. When your hypercharge super lands, it would also deal an explosion around the target that would stun the enemies for 1 second and also apply a target to them. Imagine this explosion having the same radius as Brock's second gadget, so a 1 tile radius explosion. Not to mention that you would also get the 1 second stun, which is also really nice. On top of that, while you are hypercharged, there is no limit to the amount of targets that the enemy can have. So the main idea is during this hypercharge you want to cycle as many supers as possible so that you can target, like, I don't know, maybe the entire enemy team. Because if all of them got marks, those extra marks would not be removed when the hypercharge ends. Because the hypercharge allows you to get that extra mark limit onto the enemies, which would be a very strong buff, honestly. But with all of these changes, she does need some nerfs. The bonus shield and bonus damage would be completely removed. The reality is, those buffs actually break a lot of interactions. Like Belle, it is a very versatile sniper because she does not deal that much damage, but she has area control and she also has the target deal more damage. But with the hypercharge buffs, all of that changes because she just becomes a lot tankier, honestly, and deals so much more damage, which it is a big advantage. So both of those advantages would now be gone. And the bonus movement speed would be slightly reduced from plus 26% to plus 15%. Belt, in my opinion, is all about giving those marks to the enemies, and the Hypercharge should absolutely reflect that. And honestly, I feel it would be pretty funny. I know it would be also very hard to do, but it would be pretty fun if you could just mark the entire enemy team. It would give a lot of value to this Hypercharge and also just make her super overall a lot more impactful. And finally we have Maisie. For Maisie, I will actually not do that many changes because I honestly really like the Hypercharge idea, just some tiny buffs and nerfs here and there. To start off, the Hypercharge rate will be increased from 40% to 50%. Since her charge rate nerf, she has never been the same. And the Hypercharge was one of the reasons why she was also so strong, but now because it also takes a long of time to get the Hypercharge, I feel like it makes a little bit of sense for now it to only be 50% instead of 40%. So now it would only actually take 2 supers instead of 2.5. But now let's talk about the actual super. Now the super itself silences enemies for half a second, and so do the projectiles. This is just for you to make it easier to cycle the supers in case you are hypercharged. So if you play well, it will give zero opportunity to the enemy to interrupt your cycle of supers, which can sometimes happen. It already happened to me a lot of times, just to say that. So I feel like this extra would be very helpful. Also, the projectiles would silence for half a second, but those projectiles would be more for long range interactions. And also, speaking of long range, the projectiles from the super, they will now be slightly guided, so that you could actually land them a lot easier at the end of the super range. But with that being said, there is also a nerf to those same projectiles, where now they deal half the damage and half the recharge rate. So if you actually just rush into one enemy and you're actually in a good diagonal where you hit the bonus projectile, you will not get that much extra super charge rate, which would make a lot harder for you to cycle the supers. So now if you want to try, you should definitely use the Hypercharge against 2 or more enemies. And now let's talk about the stats, because pretty much all of them are being removed or nerfed. The shield is removed, not that she had that much shield to start off, but sure. The damage is also removed. She already deals quite a lot of damage, especially for the role that she fits, but because of that, I really don't think that the Hypercharge needs any bonus damage at all. And also the bonus speed will be slightly reduced from plus 26% to plus 15%, so that she does not get that massive of a speed boost. Hopefully with these changes, the Hypercharge becomes a lot more deadly in a certain way, especially against more than one opponent, and at the same time it becomes a little bit less cancer, especially on 1v1s. And there you have it. 10 Hypercharges completely reworked, where I feel like all of them would be a lot funnier or make so much more sense with the actual character design. Hopefully with these changes, Hypercharges become a lot funnier in general. I know that this video took a really long time, and thank you so much for the patience. I know that a couple of you have been waiting literally 3 months, and I am sorry. Hopefully part 3 will not take nearly as much time, and possibly doing a part 4 after more Hypercharges getting added, just saying. So thank you so much for watching, and write your opinions down in the comments below. Trust me, I will read them, and I'll see ya on the next video.